Famed paranormal investigator Nandor Fodor stood on the deck of a steam ferry, staring out at the Irish Sea. As a paranormal investigator, Nandor had seen things that other people could only dream of, and some things he could not explain. He'd interviewed ghosts, tried to find the source of poltergeist attacks, looked into demonic possession, and he'd done this all over Europe, the United Kingdom, and in the United States. But today, standing on the ferry in the middle of the Irish Sea, heading towards the Isle of Man, Nandor was exhausted, annoyed, and pretty sure he was on a fool's errand. Because a family, the Irvings, who lived in a farmhouse in the Isle of Man, had reached out to Nandor, saying that they heard a voice in their walls. And eventually, this voice claimed to belong to an earthbound spirit that took the form of a mongoose and called himself Jeff. Despite everything Nandor had seen, he was almost positive the Irvings were trying to pull over a hoax on him. But Nandor would end up spending a week in the Irvings' home, and by the time he left, his views on the paranormal would change, and he would put forth theories that would influence paranormal investigation for generations to come. This is the story of Jeff. It was 1935 when paranormal investigator Nandor Fodor arrived on the Isle of Man. His ferry docked, the Irving family greeted him, and led him to their farmhouse. Now, despite Nandor's feelings about this case, he was nothing if not polite, so he had no intention of calling these people out, claiming they were trying to pull a hoax over on him, especially after they had kindly invited him into their home. But after sitting and talking for just a couple of hours, Nandor's opinion about the whole situation started to change, because the Irvings told him that they had spotted Jeff for the first time over 4 years earlier. They said at first Jeff was kind, soft-spoken. He offered advice that often worked out for them. But they said over time, Jeff could grow cruel and violent. Apparently, he would creep out of the walls at night, tear up their rooms, rip holes into their clothes, and get angry with them. And as Nandor spoke to the family, he began to focus on 2 members specifically, Jim, the patriarch, and his 13-year-old daughter. She was called Vera in the traditional Manx language that many spoke on the Isle of Man, which is often referred to as Vori by the English and American investigators who looked into the case. And Nandor was drawn to both of them because Jim and Vera seemed to have a much deeper connection to Jeff than anyone else in the family. They heard him more. They claimed to see him, saying that while he looked like a mongoose, he had this lovely yellow fur. And Jim and Vera seemed to be the target of any violent attacks Jeff carried out. So, Nandor told himself that as an investigator, he had to remain open-minded. And whether he would admit it to the family or not, he deeply wanted to find something. He deeply wanted Jeff to be real, because Nandor had spent decades of his life investigating the paranormal without ever finding any concrete proof. And it's important to know that Nandor had spent years in school studying hard science, and people in his own field often mocked him for how he had veered away from traditional scientific study and found his way somehow into these paranormal investigations. So, Nandor decided to stay in the family home for a week. And over the course of the week, Nandor desperately tried to make contact with Jeff. He would tap on walls, set up tables almost like he was using a Ouija board to contact this earthbound spirit. He searched through crawl spaces, even traveled to a cave where the family had claimed Jeff would often flee to when he wanted to get away from the house. But no matter how hard Nandor tried, he never made contact. He never even heard a word from Jeff. And so, being the investigator that he was, he started to interview people on the Isle of Man, people who knew intimate details about their interactions with Jeff, and Nandor was shocked that almost to a T, everyone said the same thing. They believed Vera, the 13-year-old girl, was a highly skilled ventriloquist because people had been invited into the home and they had heard Jeff, but they all walked away convinced that this young woman was able to throw her voice and make it sound like it was coming from the walls. and that Jeff had been her creation in order to gain fame or attention, or at least articles in the newspaper that talked about her. And so Nandor looked into this. He studied Vera. He continued to talk to Jim and the other members of the family. But Nandor had a completely different take than everyone else. And after dealing with the family for a week, he did not believe that they were consciously trying to trick anyone. He believed they were convinced, especially Jim and Vera, that Jeff was real, that he was a spirit who took the form of a mongoose and lived in their walls and occasionally came out to wreak some havoc. Now, Nandor did not believe Jeff was real. However, he believed that Vera and or Jim had psychically manifested a presence. Now, this was a huge change for how Nandor, or really anyone, approached paranormal investigations at the time. Nandor came to believe that humans had the ability to mentally or psychically manifest something that only they believed was real. So that Jeff was not a spirit locked to the earth by some supernatural power. He was legitimately a manifestation of some psychological or psychic trauma that Jim, Vera, and perhaps the entire Irving family were dealing with. And so their mental capacity had created this voice and this personality and this so-called spirit that they knew as Jeff. After a week at the house, Nandor Fodor got back on a ferry and headed to the United Kingdom. And when he returned to London and later to the United States, he started to really look into what he had seen or not seen on the Isle of Man. And he ended up changing the way paranormal investigation would be carried out for generations. While he never fully dismissed the possible existence of the supernatural or true paranormal activity, he came to see things like Jeff, as well as ghosts and demon possessions, and all of these things he had studied for decades as a result of human psychology and maybe psychic power. And for the later part of his career, he would dedicate himself to trying to connect the human mind to paranormal activity, and others who followed in his footsteps would do the same. And so, what started out and what sometimes still sounds like a totally absurd story about a talking mongoose living in a wall ended up having a huge effect on paranormal investigation. And maybe most importantly, Nandor Fodor's later work would go on to influence psychologists and psychiatrists for generations. And a lot of people in that field would start to look at stories of hauntings, possessions, and even things like alien abductions differently. And while they might not accept the paranormal or supernatural or extraterrestrial, they became to accept that the human mind could manifest or at least convince itself that these things were very real and that they could experience psychological and physical effects as though these things were real. And that's a lot different than simply writing off these kinds of stories as a hoax or coming to believe that these people are trying to gain fame and fortune. And so, while Nandor Fodor's views on the paranormal would change over years, his work would end up having a much larger effect on the culture at large than anything he had done before. So, what do you think? Was Jeff a manifestation, a hoax? Was the daughter just a really good ventriloquist? Or is this one of those things that we have to put in the files of the unexplained? Subscribe to Adjunct Horror before the next case file drops. We're back with a new one every Friday. All right, y'all. Bye.